Subscribe for more mysteries, unsolved and unexplained.
306. That's the exact number of crew members and passengers who vanished without a single solitary trace back in the spring of 1918. No distress call, no floating debris, 0 survivors. To this day, it actually remains the absolute largest loss of life in United States Navy history, not directly involving combat.
Welcome to this Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of the most enduring, terrifying, and honestly just perplexing maritime mysteries of the 20th century. We're talking about the unsolved disappearance of the USS Cyclops. We're going to look at the facts, trace the ship's final known steps, and really examine the most plausible theories using the historical evidence left behind. So let's dive right into this.
All right, Section 1, the behemoth unsinkable scale.
Okay, so before we can even begin to understand how totally baffling this disappearance is, we really have to wrap our heads around the sheer physical scale of this ship. I mean, we're not talking about a tiny fishing boat getting lost in a bad squall here. The USS Cyclops was launched in 1910, right? It was a Proteus-class collier, which is basically a massive floating coal mine used to refuel other naval ships out at sea. We are talking about an imposing 542-foot-long steel giant displacing over 19,000 tons. She had well over 200 men on board, plus passengers, and was even armed with 4-inch guns. A ship of this unbelievable, seemingly unsinkable scale just evaporating into thin air without leaving so much as a splinter of wood or a single cork life preserver behind, that is exactly what makes this story so incredibly wild.
Moving on to Section 2, a questionable captain, the human intrigue.
Now, any ship is only as reliable as the people operating it, right? And the Cyclops? Well, it had a seriously controversial, totally eccentric wild card at the helm. Naval investigators later dug up a pretty unsettling profile on Captain George W. Worley. First off, he was actually born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Germany. He entered the U.S. illegally by jumping a ship in San Francisco and changing his name. As a commander, he was frankly terrifying. His crew accused him of brutalizing them for the smallest things. There's even a documented instance where he supposedly chased an ensign around the ship with a literal pistol. And during calmer moments, he was known to pace the decks of this massive ship dressed in nothing but his long underwear and a derby hat. But perhaps most dangerously, especially for 1918, right in the thick of World War I, he was widely suspected of harboring pro-German sympathies. Because of his German heritage and his close ties with other German Americans, whispers of wartime treason basically followed Commander Worley everywhere. Add to this the fact that one of the passengers on this fatal voyage was Alfred Gottschalk, the U.S. Consul General in Rio. And Gottschalk was also heavily disliked for his own alleged pro-German sympathies. So you had a lot of people on board who were genuinely terrified that Worley and Gottschalk might actually be collaborating to just hand this massive, incredibly valuable ship straight over to the enemy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the final voyage, mapping the disappearance. So let's trace the critical, totally suspense-filled timeline of the ship's last known movements, because this is exactly where the warning signs really start flashing red. Tracking the final voyage, the Cyclops left Rio de Janeiro on February 16, 1918, heading north and entered Salvador on the 20th. Now here's where things take a dark turn. In early March, the ship made a completely unscheduled stop in Barbados. Why? Well, the water level was reportedly over the Plimsoll line. If you're not a sailor, that's a clear visual indicator that the vessel is dangerously heavily overloaded. Anyway, she leaves Barbados on March 4th, heading for Baltimore. There was a rumored sighting by a molasses tanker called the Amolco near Virginia around March 9th, but the Amolco's captain later completely denied it. And honestly, the Cyclops probably shouldn't have been that far north yet anyway. Regardless, after March 4th, she was absolutely never seen again.
Let's zoom in on that unscheduled stop in Barbados for a second, because it is absolutely crucial. The Cyclops was carrying 10,800 long tons of manganese ore. This is an unbelievably dense, heavy material used to make munitions for the war, and a collier just was not designed to carry it. To make matters worse, a survey board had recently confirmed that the ship's starboard engine actually had a cracked cylinder. It was totally dead. So paint this picture in your mind. You've got this erratic captain sailing an overloaded ship, packed to the brim with unfamiliar, densely packed munitions-grade ore, all while operating on just half of its engine power. It's a disaster waiting to happen.
And the dread surrounding this voyage? It wasn't just hindsight bias. People were scared while it was happening. Just listen to this chilling telegram sent to the State Department by Charles Ludlow Livingston, the U.S. consul in Barbados, right before the ship vanished. He specifically called out the broken engines, the mutinous rumblings among the crew, and the weirdly high number of Germanic names on the manifest. He ended his message with these completely haunting words: "I fear fate worse than sinking." He was deeply, deeply suspicious of the captain and genuinely feared a hijacking. It is such a terrifying pivot point right into the complete unknown.
Section 4. Theories of the Disappearance.
So what actually happened after they sailed out of Barbados? We really need to objectively evaluate the evidence and the main theories investigators came up with to explain why literally zero wreckage was ever found. The first major theory is simply the weather. The U.S. Weather Bureau recorded a violent, nasty storm sweeping through the Virginia Capes area around March 10th. We're talking 30 to 40 knot winds here. If the hobbled, heavily overloaded Cyclops, running on just at one single engine, sailed straight into this tempest, the combination of bad weather and compromised mechanics could have easily sent her straight to the bottom. To fully grasp this mystery, let's weigh the three most plausible explanations against each other. First up, German sabotage. Given the war and Worley's heritage, it kind of made sense, right? But the counter-evidence is super strong. After the war, Allied forces scoured German naval records. The German Navy unequivocally denied it, stating they had never even seen the Cyclops. Second is structural failure. A naval admiral noted that similar ships suffered from eroding I-beams due to corrosive cargo. In a severe storm, massive waves could have lifted the bow and stern, leaving the heavy middle of the ship totally unsupported, causing it to literally snap in two. Third, shifting cargo. An expert noted that manganese ore has room to shift around. The hatch covers on the ship were just canvas. If water poured in, that dense ore becomes a wet, deadly slurry. One sudden shift, and the ship capsizes instantly. But here is the catch. Naval investigators concluded that no single theory satisfactorily explains everything, especially the total lack of floating debris or any kind of distress call.
But history gives us a really eerie postscript here that strongly points back to that structural failure theory. The Cyclops actually had 3 identical sister ships. Let's look at their fates. Cyclops vanishes in 1918 carrying heavy metallic ore. Decades later, during World War II, 2 of her sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, were sold to civilian operators. In 1941, both of them vanished at sea without a single trace. And guess what they were carrying? Exceptionally heavy loads of bauxite ore. 3 identical ships, 3 identical massive loads of heavy metallic ore, 3 identical disappearances into thin air. It's like a giant neon sign pointing to a catastrophic structural flaw baked right into the ship's design when pushed to its limits.
In the end, despite massive, sweeping search efforts, the grim reality of the ocean eventually set in. On June 1, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the documents officially declaring the USS Cyclops lost and all 306 souls on board deceased. It was just a devastating finality to an entirely incomprehensible event, cementing the Cyclops as an absolutely legendary unsolved mystery.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we're still left with today. Will the sea ever actually give up the Cyclops? I mean, with today's advancing sonar and deep sea tech, there is always a chance that the rusted remains of this 19,000-ton behemoth might one day be found down there in the dark. But until then, what really happened in those final frantic moments remains one of the ocean's best-kept secrets. So, what do you think took down the mighty Cyclops? Was it a rogue wave, a wartime act of treason, or a deadly slurry of shifting ore? That's all for this explainer. Thanks so much for learning with us, and keep questioning the unknown.